We had him on just before the coaching change. He's known to most as Chris Solari, but on the show he's C Solari because soon he's going to be a symbol. We got to make that into I don't have any artistry, so I can't make you into a symbol, Chris. I'm going to have to outsource that. But he does great work for the Detroit Free Press, and we wanted to have him on to talk both things because Jeff and I, my producer and I, were talking about the Lions in the break, and that's going to be one of the main conversations. But one of the things that I want to remind people is that we've got a lot of other teams playing well in the local markets, and Michigan State basketball is one of them. Plus, we got to talk about the coaching change because it seems like when we talked to you the last time, it seemed like we thought, and I want to get your take on this, it seemed like we thought there wasn't going to be any movement, that they were going to stick with Smith at that point. They would have put themselves into the coaching carousel late, but then that's exactly what they did. A couple weeks after your last appearance, they decided to move on from Smith. They brought in Fitzgerald. So I have to imagine they had kind of identified that. They had worked on some of the funding pieces, and they decided to move on because you did a great job of highlighting kind of the difficulties in moving on with the amount of money that they have out here for these various coaches and then adding to it with Smith. But they apparently decided to pull the trigger here.
Yeah, and I think they feel confident that they'll figure out the situation with Mel Tucker. And I do think that, and I was told from a couple people that they were not going to move on unless it was Fitzgerald, unless Fitzgerald agreed to the deal. And I know that from a contractual standpoint, because he's in some ways in an image repair mode, if you will, and partly because he was able to get a significant settlement with the lawsuit for wrongful termination from Northwestern and a lot of those things. There was, and the fact that he was also I don't want to say unemployed, but he was not currently employed at that moment. So Michigan State didn't have to pay a buyout to someone else either. So I think a lot of those factors came into play. I think there was a lot of calculus that went into that. And I think when you go back and if you go listen to the press conference when Fitzgerald was announced as the head coach, everything moved pretty quickly right after the season. You know, Jonathan Smith and Michigan State wins the last game against Maryland at Ford Field on Saturday. They announce on Sunday that he's no longer going to be the coach. And then the quick move, pivot to Fitzgerald that same night. And then, you know, that the official move was made that Monday. So, I mean, but in the press conference, I think you listen to President Kevin Guskowitz, Tom Izzo, and Jay Batt. And also, I think listening to Pat Fitzgerald, there's a lot of people that really like Jonathan Smith. I don't think just as a person, and I think that's the first and foremost thing that is there, but I think a lot of people like him as a football coach, and I think he's going to find a good landing spot at some point. I just don't think this was a good fit for him for a number of reasons, and you know, the number of reasons I think ultimately comes down to, in this day and age, what the donors want. And, you know, when Fitzgerald, it was maybe not long before the game against Maryland that he started hearing some rumblings that Fitzgerald might be interested, and he was on my short list of candidates for them if they were going to move on. I think it all came together, and I think the fact that Fitzgerald and him and Smith have been friendly and know each other fairly well through the coaching ranks. I think it was an interesting press conference, to say the least. But I do the mold a little closer to regional level that Michigan State is more accustomed to than what Jonathan Smith brought.
It's about as smooth of a transition as you could have under the circumstances, I think, and that's the inclination I've gotten. I've got some people planned to be on the show that are a little bit closer to Smith and know him fairly well, and I think we'll say the same things because, like you said, we really haven't heard much in the form of negative. It was just maybe not the best match for the team, and you've been around longer than I have. You've been on the beat for a long time. It's the idea that some teams need something different. They need a change. If you have a more of a calm coach coach, sometimes you need somebody with a little bit more intensity. If you have more of a defensive coach, you need an offensive coach. Whatever it is, there's usually a kickback effect for some of these coaching changes, either at the collegiate or pro level. And that seemed to be what happened here. Fitzgerald's got some intensity, and you hit on it. I mean, man, he rallied the donor base and the fan base very quickly, and it went from kind of a general malaise in the fan base and the donor base to now we're ready to rock and roll, and he's made some good hires so far. You've been highlighting them in your articles, and he seems to have gotten momentum quickly, because the other part of the exchange, sure, they made a smooth exchange. They got him in there quickly, but his back was kind of against the wall with the new timing of everything. He had to work on retaining players. He had to work on the hires. Now he's got to be headed into the transfer portal. He's starting basically he has to be on right away, which is why he was hoarse for said press conference.
Yeah, and I think some of what you see as well, I mean, I think you need to look at the moves that he has made with this staff right out of the gate. He kept Joe Rossi, who I think you could see the corner was turned a little bit this year, especially late in the season. And, you know, he's a guy that's got Big Ten experience, and Fitzgerald knew him well for a number of reasons, but also because he was at Minnesota at the same time that Fitzgerald was at Northwestern. So he's game planned against them, and he understands the kind of defense that Rossi runs, which I think is critical. And then you start looking through some of the guys that he's kept on the staff. You know, he kept Rossi. He kept James Adams, who Rossi brought in this year to work with the safeties. He kept Brian Wozniak, who came over with Smith and his staff, and his only coaching jobs have been under Smith at Oregon State and Michigan State. But Wozniak is an Ohio guy that played at Wisconsin, so he understands the Big Ten as well. He understands the recruiting landscape in particular, and keeps them in Ohio, and keeps Courtney Hawkins, who is a guy that, you know, when you look at what Michigan State did to repair some of the bridges in the state of Michigan. I mean, Hawkins was a carryover from Mel Tucker's staff, the Smith staff, and now onto his third coach, because he knows the state of Michigan. And I think that those are all things that you look at, and a guy like Kurt Richardson, who's a little behind the scenes guy, but players love him. He's a Lansing guy, has NFL ties. So I think there's a lot of things when you see this, and you say, okay, Smith had the ship moving in the right direction. It just might not have been as quickly as, especially in this era, what people wanted. And then you pivot to what else that Fitzgerald has done. He goes out and brings home Max Bulla, which I think is an energizing move for a lot of people. And I think that's going to be a fascinating dynamic to watch him kind of serve under Rossi and kind of grow into that as a young coach to a co-defensive coordinator role. And you got a lot of fire between those three guys. I mean, Rossi was a former defensive lineman. Fitzgerald's a former linebacker. Bulla's a former linebacker. So all those guys together bring some energy. And I think it's going to be interesting, too, with the reports of Nick Sheridan coming in. Again, another guy that's worked in the Big Ten at Indiana and played at Michigan. His dad coached at Michigan State under Nick Saban. There's a lot of familiarity with the Big Ten. You can tell that this is the blueprint that Fitzgerald is bringing is getting guys who know and understand the Big Ten and how to win in the Big Ten.
And some pretty good resumes, especially for young guys. I think they played that Bulla situation perfectly because he seemed to be kind of a tweener candidate to a degree. I know there was some inclination that they might keep Rossi as they did. There was also the buyout there that you would have had to deal with. Plus, I think, like you said, they were turning a little bit of a corner. There were a lot of people that were pretty happy with him, but I think there were a lot of people that wanted to bring Bulla back, but he had a decent role there at Notre Dame. He was kind of ascending, so I wasn't sure if they would be able to pull him back, but between naming him the co-defensive coordinator and, like you said, being able to learn under a more experienced guy, they're bringing in some talent that were held pretty good positions. He was working his way up at Notre Dame, just got hired there. Sheridan was at Alabama. You know, these are guys that were ascending, but were still wanting to work on Fitzgerald's staff, which I think is a good sign for the team.
yeah, guys that are in their 30s. I mean, so they're young coaches on the come up, which I think is big, for especially Sheridan and Bulla. And I do think that you got to look at the Midwest roots of these guys. Guys, I think Keith Bonifaz, who's the running back coach, he just took a position at Cal. The West Coast guy is from Oakland, real good guy. And I think he's going to find a great landing spot at Cal that near his hometown. I think that's, there's a lot to be said about that. There's a lot to be said about Jonathan Smith and really a lot of his coaches having been West Coast guys. I think that when that hire was made, you have to remember that Oregon State was losing its conference. It was in no man's land. And I think when your coaches in that respect, you got to find the what you think is going to be a stable fit. But sometimes when you make that far of a move, it dramatically, and a lot of those guys hadn't coached coached east of the Mississippi River, there's a culture shift. And I think that there was some, at least with some of the staff members, and maybe even with Smith a little bit as well. I just think that there was not necessarily an overwhelming, what's the word I'm looking for here? I don't want to say fit, but it was a tough adjustment. Let's put it that way. And I think that these guys will probably find their way back to there. Blue Adams is a guy that he saw where he went. He landed at Florida State. He was the secondary coach. But he's a guy that's from South Florida. So, I mean, I think that some of this may be the machinations of what you're seeing in college football playing out, where guys want to be closer to home and places that they know. And I think that's what Fitzgerald's tapping into with the guys that he's bringing into his staff.
There is something to the Midwest ties as you're talking about, but it's just funny. It's got to be funny to you, Chris, to talk about Midwest ties for a conference that now stretches to the West Coast.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's going to be the real interesting thing here is that, you almost have to have some ties to each of the coasts. I think you need to have some feelers out, and I think Michigan State in the last few years and not just in football, but also in basketball, they've done a good job of recruiting the DMV area in Maryland and Virginia. I mean, a guy like Jordan Hall comes in and really is a difference maker, and that's one of those key pieces that they're going to want to keep. I think you also, though, have to stay at home, and it's going to be interesting to me to see what Nick Marsh does. I know he's in the portal. I know that he's going to be looking and exploring, but I think that they're also in keeping Courtney Hawkins. That to me makes me think that they're going to make a hard push to keep Nick Marsh because he's a playmaker, and that's something that Nick Sheridan at Alabama has done. When Ryan Grubb took over and he had a long relationship with Kalen DeBoer all the way back to their time in Sioux Falls. He took 1 year and went and ran the offense with the Seahawks, and then went to Alabama. So kind of bumped Nick Sheridan out of the OC role from the first year there. But Sheridan got a chance to work with another former Michigan State guy in Jeremy Bernard, who was an electric playmaker. And, those are the kind of guys that you need in the passing game. And I think they know that Marsh is one of those guys that is maybe not replaceable. But, again, you're also talking about what's the monetary aspect of it. I know his mom was at one of the basketball games recently, and I know that she has moved to Lansing, so it does mean a little bit of where you are and where your feet are. So that's, I think, a situation to kind of watch here in the next few weeks.
That'll be a big one. I'm glad you touched on that because I was curious about, because obviously entering the transfer portal is one thing, but actually moving is another. He can still recommit to Michigan State. But Chris, you always do this to me. You're too good on football, so then we can't transition to basketball. So we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to talk about this basketball team because they have been good to start the season, and this is a classic Izzo team to me. So I want to get your takes on the basketball team here in the second segment. So we'll come back with Chris Solari of the Detroit Free Press. Stick with us. You're listening to Sports Intel on Jethro FM. On the football team as usual, but we got to talk some hoops here, Chris, because this is a classic Izzo team to me. They obviously lost Richardson to the draft last year, but they have some veterans. They have some guys that have been around the program for a while. That's an Izzo staple in an era where we have a lot of transfer transfer portal and NIL stuff on the basketball side too. So I'm curious to get your feel for them here. They just had the long running rivalry with Oakland. I love the sweaters. Can you get a sweater like that? Can we get you a sweater? I want to get you a sweater like that.
I wish. Those are custom made. Izzo knows someone out in the West Michigan area near his beach home that has a company based around Chicago that hooked him and Lupe up with those. I think Lupe is actually the one who put the thing together, and I mean those were glorious. I mean that was a glorious. I didn't know what to expect, and I especially knowing that Izzo, the first year he wore basically the Buddy the Elf costume sweater and took a little bit of heat on it, but I think he's tapped into it and leaned into it a little bit more here the last few years, and it certainly has become an interesting little tradition. But yeah, I mean this is that was kind of the sidelight to me. I mean I think a lot of people, there were about 15,000. It was a very good crowd down at Little Caesars, and I thought Michigan State played a very good game considering. And I say that because I think this is the time of the year when Izzo, historically and especially since the Penn State game, has really been altering and moving around his lineup to kind of create some adversity. And he loves to do that, to find out how guys respond, find out how guys respond to maybe getting less minutes, getting more minutes, getting put in different roles. And then I think when you get out of, they got a game on the 29th against Cornell. They'd already played Colgate, which is going to be a very confusing couple times. But I think when they play the Cornell game, I think you may see a little more tinkering and a little more shaping towards what you're going to see on January 2nd when they have to go play a really tough road game in a really tough environment at Nebraska. And that's I think what he's looked towards since that Penn State game is, okay, you got through the major games in your non-conference schedule. You beat Kentucky, you beat Arkansas, you beat North Carolina, and you took Duke to the limit. Now you're going to find out what is real and how much better can you get.
That's interesting to think of it in that way. We know that he schedules a lot of adversity. You just read off a lot of the top teams that they played thus far, but I didn't think of that from a roster standpoint too, but he does do that. Especially they do have some young guys on this team. That's one reason for hope, because he's got a veteran-laden team, which is usually better for Izzo, but he's also got some young guys that you feel like could get better as the season goes on, because they are getting significant minutes. You could see some growth from, say, a Scott. Ugachukwu has looked good in limited time. McCullough has been back and forth, but he's looked decent. He's trying those guys out to see who's going to have the medal going forward as the Big Ten season picks up, because you needed the tough out of conference schedule, because the Big Ten's going to be very tough seemingly this year, as it normally is.
Yeah, and Ugachukwu has been a big pickup, and he was kind of almost an afterthought in this cycle as a late portal addition, but he's been kind of the pivot point in a lot of these moves, because he brought him in to back up Jeremy Fears, and, what that meant would be how many minutes, right? I mean, the ideal thing is you get Fears playing 30 to 32 minutes a game. The more ideal thing would be get him to play more, but I think he's started to see a little bit that, Fears is, with the after the shooting is still kind of working that back to get to that point. And, he wants to keep him fresh while also playing at a high level. And Ugachukwu had been backing him up at point guard. Well, he moves him in at the two guard at Penn State. And that disrupts the rotation from what he had done for the first 8 games or so through the Duke game. And Ugachukwu responded. He had a big game at Penn State, hit 5 threes. I think he scored 23 in that game. Really helped carry them in a tough game, but because he moved to the 2 and spent most of his time there and a little bit of time at the 1, that meant you have to move the Harvard transfer, Doug Wojcik's kid, Denim Wojcik, in as the backup point guard, and that that's a little shaky. He was brought in kind of just as a roster filler to kind of get an extra body there for a backup point guard in case of injuries. He's got Ivy League experience, Division I experience, but you saw again in that Penn State game, when it comes to playing against the higher level of competition, maybe he's not there. Maybe he's more of a role guy. Maybe you need him for, 2 minutes before and after a timeout or something like that, or at the end of the half in foul trouble. I think that was one of those things. This segment is important for Izzo for this roster is who can I count on in case there is an injury? And I do think that you'll eventually see Ugochukwu move back a little bit more towards the one, especially with the emergence of Jordan Scott. I think he's got the length and size and defensive capability that none of the other guys at the two guard have. I mean, Kurt Tang is a guy, and Trey Ford, that they're two guys that are 6'4", that are not necessarily the same kind of defenders that Izzo has seen with Jordan Scott as a freshman. And I think Cam Ward had a little bit of a wrist injury, so he's kind of working his way back a little bit. So you've seen Jesse McCullough, as you mentioned, getting some of those minutes and showing that he's going to be a force. He redshirted last year. He's in his first year of eligibility, basically playing wise, and has shown he can stretch the floor a little bit from outside. He can bang inside. He's going to still need to get tougher and stronger. But this is the time of the year that Izzo needs and wants to find those things out.
And he is finding some good pieces. Like you said, McCullough, he's shown the ability to be a stretch big, which will be helpful. Obviously, they've got a great big man rotation. We haven't even mentioned, the three main kind of engines of this team, along with Fears being Carr, Kohler, and Cooper. There's got to be a nickname in there, Chris. We've got some alliteration. I know they don't all start with a C, but I feel like there's got to be a nickname for those guys.
The big three C's.
Yeah, exactly.
But I listen, and you can go to 4 C's and call it Jeremy Fears because he's the captain of the ship, man. I mean, all 4 of those guys are listed as captains, but this is Jeremy Fears' team. And I think what you've seen, even with all the things that Izzo's done and shaking up the lineup here since the Duke game and moving guys in and out, is this team is going to go as its best 4 players are in those 4 guys, those 4 veterans. That's why he kept that nucleus together. That's why that, the guys like Holloman when they left and Xavier Booker, those were the ones that kind of fell by the wayside because Izzo likes that group of 4 guys. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see just how much better the 2 guys that I think that really still have a long way to go to reach their ceiling are Fears and Carr. There's Carr had a tough start at the outset of the Oakland game, but really for the first time this season, we saw him turn it on a little bit. He played a little more 4. And Fears, he's still up and down with his offensive game. They're going to need more from him on the offensive side. That doesn't mean scoring 20 a night. That doesn't mean he's a ball distributor first and foremost. But he's got to be able to show that he can score, on the drive and really a couple jumpers here and there to force defenses out on him so he can create when he penetrates.
That's a great point because he's such a prolific passer. Fears is that he can go to that pretty much any time. He's got Carr and Cooper to lob to. Kohler's been a nice inside-outside guy. But yeah, if you can get that defense stretched a little bit and not as compressed with those big guys who can stretch the floor themselves, then you're opening things up for yourself. Essentially, it's nice that he's that unselfish, but he's a rare player that you actually want him to shoot a little bit more.
Yeah, you got to get the open shot. I mean, there's a couple points where he's made some moves into the paint where he's trying to create. I mean, he's a master at creating contact, but I think sometimes when he gets into the paint, it's not always about trying to just finish it at the rim on a layup. Sometimes it's a little step back. I've seen that here and there with him where he'll get into the paint and take that hard plant and push back and hit that little floater in the paint. Mateen Cleaves used to do that all the time. And, I think the other thing, too, is like for him and Carr, it doesn't always have to be about what are you doing outside of the arc. Sometimes, and the same with Carson Cooper as well, it's you can create that spacing by hitting inside the arc. Whether it be Carr from elbow to elbow, And the same with Cooper. Cooper, between the elbows and his little baseline jumpers, he doesn't have to step out behind the arc when you've got guys that are hitting. And I think that's the other thing, too, is this team has done a better job of shooting the three since that real rough 3-game start to the season. It kind of looked rough like last year, how bad they were from the arc. But they're shooting at about 40+% clip since those first 3 games. So that if you get Carr hitting 1 or 2 a game, if you get Fears hitting the open looks when defenses sag off them, then you put pressure on the defense. You put pressure on opposing defenses because they're not going to know how to stop you if you show you've got diversified weapons.
The outside shooting was a key last year. They could beat anybody when they were hitting from the outside, but like you said, it wasn't super consistent. Now it seems to be that way this year. They're a little bit more consistent without it, but it's nice that it's trending up. But it's a fun team to watch. We'll be following them, and we'll be having Chris back on to update as the season goes on here, hopefully with a deep tournament run for the Spartans fans. But we appreciate you joining the show. Appreciate all the knowledge on the football and basketball side. Be sure to tell people where they can follow you here, Chris.
Yeah, you can find my stuff at freep.com, and I'm all over the socials. Just look for my name, Chris Solari, at Chris Solari on X, and some on Blue Sky, and sometimes you'll find me just randomly floating in some of the random corners of the internet.